Welcome to Healthy Brain, Happy Body, a podcast from the Northeast Region Biofeedback Society. I'm Dr. Saul Rosenthal, a health psychologist in the Boston area, and your host as we investigate the incredible connections between brain and body. Listeners, we're back with Dr. Alice Flaherty, and she's a neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital and associate professor of neurology and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. We've been talking about hypergraphia and creativity, so both pathologic creativity and I suppose maybe non-pathologic creativity, but I do want to talk a little bit now about some of the clinical implications. So in your work, when you're working with patients, do you see any parallels between, say, hypergraphia and other compulsive disorders, behavioral compulsive disorders like gambling or social media use?
Yeah. And I think gambling and social media use and things like that tend to be appetitive. You know, they're approach behaviors, not avoidance behaviors. And like one of the ways I was spending my energy when I was manic, I'd get obsessed with like finding a watch on eBay when I knew I didn't even need a watch. I was looking for a watch with like a moon watch, you know, or something like that. And I would spend hours searching. It was just this drive to search, you know, pursuit behavior. And so that was all going on. Part of the reason I focused on the hypergraphia was because it was socially more useful than the eBay stuff. But so I see this a lot in my patients who have Parkinson's because I give them medicines that boost dopamine. So, you know, I have my bipolar patients and I'm suppressing their dopamine, or my Tourette's patients, I'm suppressing their dopamine, and then my Parkinson's patients, I'm boosting it. And a lot of them go from being very sober people to gambling, to becoming hypersexual, to writing their autobiographies, to composing music. I had one person who was a composer already who he became a photographer, you know? Was that emergent creativity, or was it just, you know, this weird genre shift? And he was like, I don't know why I'm doing this. But so that's one of the clinical implications for me is the Parkinson's patients who some of their aspects of their drive can be very useful. Like one physicist who said, you know, I used to love physics, but now I love my physics. And he himself felt it was like different, you know, but that was okay. And so I would try not to pathologize when I accidentally do that to people. I don't want to pathologize stuff that's fun for them and not causing any problems, you know, making glass sculptures in the front yard or whatever.
Right. Well, I'm beginning to understand, I think, why dopamine is your favorite molecule. And then what about on the other side? So have you worked with people maybe who have bipolar disorder and diminished their creative output?
Yeah.
And what's that like?
And there's a great quote from Sylvia Plath about how she was trying to approach this theory of, you know, do you have to be sick to be a poet, basically? And she was like, when I was sick, that's all I was. I wasn't a poet. It was just too. So in some ways, treating somebody's illness that's giving them all these drives is suppressing their drives, but it also may make it possible for them to write a complete sentence, you know, rather than being scattered. But it's a huge, huge issue for anybody in one of these drive states because it's, at least at some level, seems very important and necessary. And then even independent of that, when you calm people down, then it's sort of like, it's something like, I often thought of this metaphor in my own life, but it's like when a soldier comes back from war and regular life is so boring. You know, they're glad not to be in a war anymore, but they have to get used. It takes a lot of it's like withdrawal from a drug. You have to finally be able to experience pleasure in small things. And my sensibilities would get very coarsened by mania, and there were a lot of things that just bored the hell out of me.
It does make me think of when I've worked with patients who are, have sort of newly emerging bipolar disorder. They really don't want to go on the medications because they have such important things to do, and they have this belief, which is valid, that the medications will kind of tamp it down.
Yeah, and it does. And I remember I luckily had a psychiatrist who was so good about letting me dig my own holes, or not my grave, luckily. But
Mm.
I was trying to get to what seems like the goal, that little level of hypomania where you're not coming out of your skull with misery. You're just in that hypomanic state. And I feel like I managed to do it for about 9 months, where just by
Mm-hmm.
titrating stuff, like I would take a little Zyprexa and I thought I needed it and it kept from ramping up. And it ended up being so agonizing at this sort of meta level. I was sick of everything being meaningful. I just wanted stuff to be not meaningful. And this happened a bunch of times where the depression was a relief, because
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
not care about stuff, and everybody, I feel bad talking to people with real depression because they're like, how can you say that the depression was relief? You can't have been that depressed. So part of me is like, you're right. Part of me was like, no, I was so depressed that I didn't worry about being depressed. I didn't care that I was not moving. It was a recovery in a way. Like when we think about what these states are doing, the reason they exist is to some extent they're adaptive. And the depression helped me calm down from all that overstimulation.
Mm. So the titration is incredibly difficult, and even for you who knows what you're doing, which I don't know, it gets me to wonder, well, what is successful treatment, particularly for someone who is a creator.
Well, I think of some
Um,
people I know who are kind of hyperthymic all the time, like my friend who's a painter, Warren Prosperi, who he just paints all the time. As we've
mhm.
talked about, he's never had anything approaching a manic episode. His wife, Lucia, agrees. But he started when he was like 6, and the Jesuits in his Catholic school told him, "You're good at that." So he left school, went up to the MFA, and started painting pictures in the copying things in the MFA, and taught himself. He's made a career of it. He's constantly motivated and engaged and stuff. He's a little tiring to be around because he's always
Mhm.
engaged. Hi Warren, if you're listening, I still love you. But he's always engaged like that. And that's, I think, what we all want. It's just, for me, I didn't have the stamina. I couldn't, either I was titrated up too high. I mean, I think people might say that about me now. I don't know that I'm in that, like, always engaged state,
Mhm.
because I don't have mood swings anymore. It's like I'm titrated. Um,
Mhm.
so maybe that's the goal. But I also feel like, happiness is its own punishment in a way. Like when you have one emotion or one state for too long, it was like not good. And so I needed to be depressed. Like I wanted to be sad. Um, it was, I mean, depression and sadness, I don't want to really get them confused, because for me, depression
Right.
wasn't about being sad. I was sad when I was
Right.
mad. But um, I wanted the change. It's like people that don't want to live in Florida. They want seasons.
Mhm. So we say we like about up here in New
We're
England, right?
all. It's like we all. A friend who's a psychiatrist said to me that we all think our illness makes sense, and that's probably true of New Englanders too. Like we
Right.
think the seasons
Yeah.
make sense.
Right. Well, so you wrote the book. Is 2004?
That was when it was
Is that
published. Yeah.
when it was published? Okay. So obviously, we've learned a few things since then. What if you were to do another edition of the book? What sorts of things would you include that we've learned?
There has been some progress in creativity research, and I think, to me, the most interesting part has been like what types of motivation are to produce it. Like for those of you who are bosses in the audience, like instilling fear in your employees is going to be less productive. It's easier to control and to make people afraid of you than to foster their goal drive, but it's not as good for creativity. But actually, in a way, as a clinician, I almost wouldn't want to write that second edition, because in medicine there's this whole other side of me that thinks that there's ways that creativity can be harmful. And
Hmm.
one of the ways is when I have creative residents, and they're like, they'll have a patient who's in anaphylactic shock or whatever, and they're like, oh, this is so cool. They go and read about anaphylaxis and they invent this new treatment. In the meantime, the patient's dead, right? Or they try the
Right.
treatment, and Edison or someone said that 99% of creative ideas are bad,
Right.
then you don't want to have a creative doctor. And I have to keep reminding myself of that when I'm with patients, especially creative patients, and we really get into trying these things. And I have to say, we should just make sure that we have some oversight because it's dangerous, So I don't want to belittle creativity, but there's a big difference between being a creative writer, where all you're doing is wasting paper, and being a creative surgeon. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that's why, like, I use for my patients with brain stimulators, we have these devices that recently they look a little better, but for a long time they were like Sputnik era things. And
Right.
people would say, why can't you just have an iPhone? Like an iPhone would do it so much better. iPhone stuff progressed so much faster because no one died if there was a
Mm-hmm.
glitch in the operating system. Um,
Right.
and so I, perhaps it's age that I'm more conservative, but at least in medicine, my patients that want to be in trials, they want a brain graft instead of something that's been tested. I'm like, oh no.
Mm. Well, we live in interesting times as far as all of that is concerned. So you've talked about yourself. You sort of feel titrated more or less, but do you just still feel the pull of hypergraphia?
I feel the pull and also the meta pull. Like if I'm not feeling the pull, I want to have the pull.
Mm-hmm.
And even at the time, like my psychiatrist would say, you think you like this state, but you're also miserable. And that was true. I was trying to get out of it. I was taking my meds, but I also wanted it. And I still have memories of not being titrated. Um, so if somebody could offer me a pill right now that would put me back in that state, I would probably take it. But I also know
Mm-hmm.
that if that pill existed and I now take it 20 years later, I'll probably just get depressed and suicidal or something. Like it probably wouldn't work. But
Mm-hmm.
but also I know I was like I nearly wrecked my family. I was a nightmare for everybody I worked with. I would corner people in the hallway and just start talking about myself. I was a nuisance.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried, with my patients, there's the whole wounded healer thing. I want to be more sensitive to my patients who have issues like mine. But it's also true that I look at them and they make me hate myself more. I'm like, oh, he's so annoying. I was like that. Oh my god. And it's complicated. But yeah, I would go back in an instant if I knew it was for like 4 months. 4 months for me is a good cycle length. Too
Right.
much more or too much less, that's exhausting.
Mm-hmm. Well, in general, I mean, since we don't have that pill for you, how has your relationship with writing changed over time?
Um, it's hard to say. Like, so I'm in a slump at the moment. I finished a book that was very fun to do, but right now I'm like, I'm not a writer. Like, I'm old. I don't need to do this. But that's usually how I feel right before it starts again. I mean, I'm still cycling
Mm.
in this mild way. And in the old days, I would try to encourage myself. Like, when I felt absolutely flat, I'd be like, this is always what happens right before something, the opponent process in my brain would kick in and put me
Mm-hmm.
in gear. Um, and it was almost, I don't know if this is true, but like, it was almost that ability to encourage myself out of depressions by saying, oh, this is good because it means you're going to have a mania. It would make the depression less, but that would make the mania less. So in a way, wanting the state calmed it down in a way, but I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Mm-hmm.
only because I was sort of titrating and taking my meds and stuff.
Right. Well, what advice would you give to writers who might also be experiencing these sort of mood shifts?
I would say, um, oh my God. So, like, the kind of advice that I secretly would give, for instance, so people, let's say, I have a couple of, a lot of patients who are pretty high functioning bipolar. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, don't tell anybody we're doing this, but I want you to take your Zyprexa as needed. Like, take it when you start to ramp up. I'm like, this could go
Mm-hmm.
very wrong. Maybe you should tell your spouse that, that you and your creative doctor are doing this like bad thing. But it really was
Mm-hmm.
helpful for me to be able to nip it in the bud when it got to a certain point. So it takes a lot of, you know, um, ability to look at yourself from the outside, because as soon as you get on that ramp up, that's when you want to ramp up more. It becomes more and more important. And so to be able to cut it off at the right point is hard. But I think a lot of people actually manage that. They just don't publish it because it's a dangerous strategy.
But superficially, it seems like it violates your rule about not being a creative
Yes,
clinician.
when I say I hate creativity, I'm talking to myself. Like, don't do
Right.
that.
Mm-hmm.
There's so
And
many
yet,
things that I've done. I try not to make them. I'm definitely the kind of doctor that'll be just like, well, I don't know if it's going to work. Let's just try it. That's not good.
good. So you wouldn't recommend that to other clinicians?
Well, I would, but I would say don't listen to me. I'm crazy.
Is there anything else that you'd want us to know about the creative drive and its relation to obsessive drive or pathology?
We could talk about meds a little. I mean, when people
Mm,
want to hear about these drives, it's usually because they want to influence them. They want to have more of something. And,
sure.
partly from my own experience of having too much meaning, there's a sweet spot, right? There's too little
Hmm.
dopamine, there's too much dopamine, and to some extent, meds and also behavior can affect where you are on that curve. But the classic thing that I see in creative or blocked people is they're trying to get their activation in a certain zone, right? So we
Right.
all want to be alert, and we always think like more alertness is better. Uh, but what happens is the meds we're using are sort of sluggish. So the sort of coffee alcohol cycle is a good example. You wake up in the morning, you're sluggish, and so you drink some coffee, and it doesn't really kick in. So you have some more coffee, and then you're anxious all day, and you're revved up, and you can't get to sleep. And at night, you have some alcohol, and the first glass doesn't really do anything, and probably built up some tolerance. And then you have to drink until you're like squashed, and then you have a rebound. So that's bad. But it's also true that if you just save your coffee for like twice a week, you can do a lot even with just coffee. To
Hmm.
if you time it right. And so I've wasted a lot of time trying to figure out when the coffee is good for me and when it's not. Um,
Hmm.
and that's that's also true of exercise, right? So exercise is really good for creativity, which I didn't know when I was, like the nerd in high school looking at all those athletes and thinking they're stupid, they're all head of companies because actually exercise is good for you.
Right.
And they had social skills and could work in groups. But anyway, um, so exercise is really good for me, but I find that I never expected this. When I start exercising more than 3 times a week, I want to exercise a lot more and a lot more. And then I'm exercising and not writing. And so
Hmm.
then I have to back off and then I don't want to exercise at all. So I think a lot of people probably have a wider, it's not a knife edge that way, but all I
Right.
mean is
Well,
it
I
doesn't have
and
to be meds or like light exposure. So I love my light box. If I wake
hmm,
myself up an
hmm.
hour earlier than I really should be waking up, I feel great. Um, and so that kicks in pretty fast. Unlike meds, everybody on my floor now has a light box because when you turn it on, you're just more awake. It just wakes you up, right?
Yeah.
So,
It's
so yeah,
another common New England device.
yeah, yeah.
It, it seems like you would have to know yourself really well and be willing to do the titration process is dynamic, and to be able to to pull yourself back when you might not really want to. And that's a tough. I think that's a tough call. But it's ultimately it's when I think about the work that I do clinically, we're always, or at least often, trying to get people to that middle path, as it's sometimes called, and that's a dynamic place. It's a lot harder to be there than to be at either end.
Yeah.
So as you're saying, being a creative clinician and trying to help your patients get there, or being a creative patient, sounds like a challenge for many.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there's so many interesting issues that aren't necessarily creative, but um, maybe this is maybe a tangent. But anyway, I agree with you. But a tangent is the contagion of creativity. So,
Mm,
was it Aristotle or Plato or somebody that said that the muse is contagious? It can be passed from one inspiration can be passed from one person to another, and that's a whole social aspect of all of this. That's not meds. It's not light therapy. It's not exercise. But is incredibly powerful. And one of the ways that we can help our patients be more creative is to play with them, is play in the serious play sense.
right.
And if you take their treatment as something exciting, like an exciting game in the serious sense of game, um, that can make them engage in it in a way that it's not just like I hate my meds, but it's like my meds are a tool that I can use to build a house or whatever. Um,
Yeah, I find that's often the difficult first step before they'll agree to take it, is to see it that way versus it's going to make me a different
mhm.
person. Well, yeah, but not in a bad way.
I mean, I'm probably lucky in that my patients tend to be not as sick. Like really sick people go, they don't see a neurologist for their bipolar disorder.
Right,
but
right, right.
but giving people a sense of agency, which is, of course, another dopaminergic function, when they feel like they have a role in what dose they're going to be taking, makes them a lot more compliant. I learned that from my psychiatrist. She's like, I'm not going to tell you to take that pill, because then you're totally not. I'm going to say,
Right.
it's your choice. If you want to fuck up your life and not take your medicine, do it in a more subtle way, that then puts it on me. And then I have this sense that it's me doing it. It's both, I'm going to behave myself, and I'm also going to be much more engaged in the process. And so the kind of top-down approach to prescribing is very counterproductive.
Well, Alice, thank you so much for joining us. It was really interesting conversations we've had about the dark side of creativity, if you want to call it that. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. This was fun.
This has been Healthy Brain, Happy Body. I'm your host, Dr. Saul Rosenthal. Our guide today was Dr. Alice Flaherty, neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Neurology at Harvard Medical School. She is the author of numerous books and studies, including The Midnight Disease, a discussion about creative drive, writer's block, and hypergraphia, the compulsion to write. Find out more about her and her work in the show notes. Subscribe to this podcast by clicking the subscribe here link or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy Healthy Brain, Happy Body, please rate us and leave reviews at Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. Reviews help us to get more listeners, and that's more people who can learn about and to benefit from biofeedback, neurofeedback, and other mind-body approaches to health. Also, let us know what you think by sending us email. Our address is healthybrain@nrbs.org. Healthy Brain, Happy Body is produced and edited by me. The theme music is Catch It by Coma Media. It is a production of the Northeast Region Biofeedback Society. Go to nrbs.org to find out more about the organization, including our trainings, monthly webinars, and yearly conference. All opinions expressed are those of our guests and not the NRBS. This podcast is not meant to replace advice from qualified healthcare providers. Healthy Brain, Happy Body is supported by the sponsors of NRBS. Be sure to join us on our next episode as we continue to explore the keys to our well-being on Healthy Brain, Happy Body.